All right, I guess it's on. Good morning. So, gonna be the name of the presentation, Iberian Astral Magic or the Images of Solomon. A bit of a tongue-in-cheek title. Basically, what I'm gonna be talking about is this idea that sometimes pops up in the very small world of Iberian magic studies and esotericism, which is the ideas on the relationship between astral magic and the general Iberian or Hispanic geographical territory. Now, there is a very good paper by Nicolas Whale-Paro, La Hispanidad de la Magia Astral, or the Hispanicity of Astral Magic. If you're interested in the topic, I do advise this paper if you can read it. It's in Spanish. And basically, he describes what is a type of narrative that sometimes pops up in Iberian scholarship. And the narrative goes something like this. Well, in the 13th century, books such as the Picatrix or the Libro de Libro de Astromagia were translated by Alfonso X. Then in the 14th century, you have relevant Iberian authors and esotericists such as Arnaldo de Villanueva, who wrote and disseminated information about astral magic. And then in the 15th century, you have other authors. He mentions Jerónimo Torrella, not as famous as Arnaldo de Villanueva, who wrote the book Opus, Praeclarum, Imaginibus, Astrologicis. Now, Whale-Parrot's argument here is that while this is all fine and good, there are some problems. Namely that Arnaldo de Villanueva actually acquired his knowledge of astral magic among the Jewish population of Montpellier, and Torrella actually wrote his book in Italy because he thought people in Valencia, where he was from, didn't know anything about astral magic. So there is actually no continuity between these events. These are separate things that happen, and you can only describe them as a continuity if you look at them from very far away, if you don't analyze them. Now, this is a fair statement to make. I agree with Whale-Parrot. There is no Hispanicity of astral magic if you are looking at evidence such as this. However, I do not believe this is the entirety of the story. When you're talking about magic, in particular in an environment such as Iberia, which, like many other places, magic was an illegal practice, a lot of the magical practice will be happening in marginal circuits. So you cannot really make a fair statement about the practice of magic in this territory if you solely look at well-established and reputed books made by well-established and reputed authors, published in well-established and reputed publishers. You do need to look at criminals. It just so happens that that's exactly what I've been doing for the past years. I've been reading many Inquisition trials from several Iberian Inquisitions, and I believe that I have found references to a number of manuscripts circulating in marginal circuits that deal with astral magic. One of these cases is the Lisbon Inquisition case of Alonso Carrillo Albornoz. Alonso had a number of books in his possession, two of which, by the titles that are given to them, suggest themselves strongly as being of astral magic. One of the books is mentioned by a number of titles. The Week of Enrique de Villena, the use of the images of the most excellent art of the Week of Solomon, the uses of the images of Dom Enrique de Villena. Another book he had is referred to as the Picatrix on the images of Solomon, Philosophos Picatrices de Imaginibus Salomonis e Plantici, or the images of Solomon. Now, I realize that Picatrix there, it might suggest that this might just be a Picatrix. It is not. From what we know of this title, it appears to just be an appropriation of title for authority, I suppose. Another case from the Toledo Inquisition, the trial of Antonio de la Fuente Sandoval, mentions that he had a book called The Use of the Images of the Most Excellent Art of the Week of Solomon. And finally, from the Cuenca Inquisition, the case of Jerónimo de Liavana, he had two books, Liber Magis Philosophos Picatrici de Imaginibus Salomonis and the Libro de Annulorum Quattro Speculoi Imagin Tobiae, the book of 100 rings, 4 mirrors, the images of Toby. Now, immediately here, we can notice that one of the books in Alonso's possession has a very similar title to the Fuente Sandoval book. And the other book in Alonso's possession has a very similar title to one of the books of Jerónimo de Liavana. This suggests the existence of literary traditions or traditions of titles of astral magic manuscripts circulating in Iberia. So now let's look at these 3 books that we have, try to analyze them, and figure out what these books can inform us about the practice of astral magic in Iberia. Now, just for simplification purposes, I'm going to condense these titles. The first book I'm just going to refer to as The Week of Solomon, attributed to Enrique de Villena. The second book, let's take the Picatrix out to not confuse us, just call it The Images of Solomon. And the last book, I'm going to keep the title, because that title is very good and useful, and you'll see why. So now, looking at all of these documents, what can we go on to analyze these books? Well, The Week of Solomon, we have 2 qualifications on this book. One from the Alonso trial, the other one from the Fuentes Sandoval trial. Now, qualifications are documents that the Inquisition tended to produce. Basically, every time they found a book, but they could do these things for things that weren't books, but frequently when they found a book, and the book was thought to be heretical or magical, it would be sent to a specialized reader. This reader would analyze the book and write a report. This report is called a qualification. And in that report, he had to justify why the book was heretical. When you're investigating magic books and manuscripts, short of finding a manuscript, this is the best thing you can find, because frequently qualifiers will make block quotes from the book they are analyzing, or offer very detailed information on the structure and content of the book, so you can extract a lot of things from this. So we have 2 qualifications. The Images of Solomon and the Book of 100 Rings and 4 Mirrors, we actually have 2 full manuscripts. The Liabana case had his 2 books were attached as evidence. So now let's analyze one of these books at a time. The first off, Week of Solomon, attributed to Enrique de Villena. Just to resolve this Enrique de Villena issue, what does this refer to? Now, Enrique de Villena was a 14th century Aragonese nobleman. It is known that he had esoteric interests and contacts in esoteric communities among the Jews and Muslims of Iberia. He was a writer, and 2 books that he wrote, the Treatise of Fascination and Treatise of Astrology, are frequently listed as esoteric books. This is a bit of a contemporary projection. We tend to project esotericism upon these books. By the standards of their time, they're really not all that esoteric. This is very straightforward, common technical knowledge. It's not really particularly special in his time period. However, when he died, his library was examined, and indeed he did have a few magic and image magic books, Liber Raziel, the Kiranis, and the Picatrix. These books were later publicly burned in Cuenca, and from these stories, from these references throughout the Iberian early modern period, you have that the name of Enrique de Villena gets attached and associated with a number of alchemy books and, as the current case, magic books. Now, he had nothing to do with these books. This is a process similar to what happened with Paracelsus or Agrippa in the rest of Europe, where their names get attached to magic books that they had nothing to do with. So that's what's happening here. Now, let's look at the qualifications of the Alonso and the Antonio trials. The qualification of the Alonso book, the qualifier mentions, well, this book opens with a treatise of secrets. Besides this, it contained instructions on the creation of a mirror to see hidden things, instructions on how to see hidden things in a bowl of water, and it's implied that this bowl of water would have a familiar spirit residing in it. It also contained the art to house the spirit Behemoth in the crystal. Besides the qualification, reading the trial, there are other rituals mentioned. There is instructions for the creation of a pentacle that would house a familiar, then you would wear it on your chest for protection. Something called the apple ritual, which seemed to be used to attract a sexual partner, and instructions for the creation of a ring of 3 nymphs, which was a ring that contained 3 familiar spirits, and each of these spirits would give you a special power, like winning at gambling or invulnerability. Besides these specific rituals and instructions for talismans, there are equal instructions for the consecration of a magic sword, a dagger, a compass, something referred to as the irons, which were the tools that you would use to carve astrological images in these talismans, and all of these things would need to be consecrated on a Catholic altar. Now, the Fuentes Sandoval book, while this is referred to as a single work, it was divided into 2 books. One bound in blue with gold with 4 yellow ribbons, and the other one had several silk ribbons of different colors, and these books were consecrated by a Roman priest. In terms of content, the qualification tells us this contained instructions for the summoning of a spirit into a glass bowl filled with water, and instructions for the housing of a spirit in a crystal. So immediately we have a coincidence here. Not only are the titles of the two books in the possession of these individuals pretty close to each other, we also know that the content was equally close. So we are dealing with a literary transmission, literary tradition. There is a genealogical relationship between these two books. Whatever that relationship is, I don't know, and we don't have data to say anything about it. Now, looking at this from a general perspective, this book seemed to be specialized in the use of astral magic techniques for the creation of talismans, and these talismans will later be used to house familiar spirits. Not only this, but there seems to be a clear departure from what might be called regular, quotation marks, regular astral magic techniques. I know I'm generalizing, but astral magic can be considered not necessarily a supernatural activity, but a technical knowledge for the manipulation of astrological influences, which are in essence natural. However, from the moment that we are talking about housing familiar spirits, particularly spirits of a Judeo-Christian backing, such as Behemoth, or the use of a Catholic altar in order to consecrate certain objects, we are calling into play explicitly supernatural forces, and particularly supernatural forces from a Christian Catholic perspective. So we have here this departure from Arabic, purer, I don't want to say pure, but a departure from Arabic astral magic techniques towards a more Catholic and Christian context. So there seems to be, you can refer to this as indeed an approximation of these techniques to a Iberian context, so something that you might call Iberian astral magic. Now, the second book, The Images of Solomon, we don't have to guess at what this book was. We do have a manuscript. Obviously, we don't know if the one in Alonso's possession is the same as this, but we do have one. In terms of physical description, fairly lengthy text, 26 folios, written in a single color, written in Castilian, vernacular, and Latin. The Latin and the Castilian aren't mixed. They are actually, the text starts in Castilian. At a certain point around folio 12, just switched to Latin. I assume whoever made this copy was doing a translation and just got bored. The rest of the text is in Latin. In terms of content, the book opens with a fairly straightforward theoretical description of astral magic, talking about the planets, metallic correspondences, and color correspondences. Then it just offers descriptions of 12 talismans for each of the 7 planets, to a total of 84. All these talismans are described as metal statuettes, and besides these, there are also instructions for the consecration of magic tools, which once again are done in a Catholic altar, so pretty much in line with the previous book. Now, the last book, it's a very small book, 6 folios, but it's the most mysterious of them all. So this is written in red and black ink. Besides the text, there are 3 Catholic devotional images bound together with this book. There doesn't seem to be any particular relationship between the images and the book and the text. I assume they just got bound together for talismanic purposes. And it's written in Latin and an astrological cipher. Basically, there's a block of text. It's just a string of astrological signs. This is quite unfortunate because when I was in Cuenca analyzing this, I was reading the trial, and the key to this cipher is actually given in the documentation. The Inquisition got it out of him because Liabana was using the cipher to write letters. At the time, I didn't realize that the cipher was also used in the manuscript, so I didn't take note of it. I did take note of the page where this was, so I'll eventually just ask for digitalization, and hopefully when I get down to actually analyzing this in depth, I'll be able to translate this piece of text. Now, in terms of content, it's a very small book. It appears, my Latin is atrocious, but from what I can read from it, it appears to contain one single consecration / exorcism ritual. It has a magic circle which seems to be meant for this consecration. And if I'm reading the text correctly, the ritual is meant for stones and metals. And I'm assuming it's a preliminary step to use then these stones and metals for the creation of talismans. Now, out of all of these books, this is the only one that I've managed to track throughout history somewhat, which is actually, it does not simplify our understanding of this book, but rather complicate it. This is an example. For example, 13th century book by Albertus Magnus, Speculum Astronomiae. Albertus Magnus mentions a book of astral magic called the Book of Four Rings. The Book of Four Rings, according to Albertus Magnus, describes itself as being the work of four of Solomon's students, Tos Graecos, Fortunatus, Eleazar, and Macarius. Now there's a section of text in our current book, the Book of 100 Rings and Four Mirrors, which basically says the same thing, but instead of these four names, it mentions Tos Greco, Arnaldo de Villanueva, the Abbot Tritemius, and Cornelius Agrippa. So there is a similarity in text. Again, this suggests a certain genealogical relationship in terms of text, or at least in terms of this claim of authority. How one text translates into the other, how they connect, again, I have no clue on this. Besides this, the Portuguese Index of Forbidden Books of 1559, which was the republication of the Roman Index of 1557, lists a list of forbidden books, as the index that it is. One of these books is mentioned as the Liber de Annualorum Quater Speculoi Imaginum Tobiae. So basically, we are guaranteed that in Italy, in the mid-16th century, a book with this same title was known. More complicated than this. Nicholas Eymerich's fundamental Directorium Inquisitorium, 14th century. Eymerich is complaining about magic books getting into Iberia from France and Italy, and he equally mentions Libro de Annualorum Veneris, Libro Quater Speculorum, Libro Imaginum Tobiae. So we are at least guaranteed that books with this title were known in Iberia from the 14th century. If the content of these books is the same as the book that today we can consult in the Cuenca Inquisition archives, I cannot say, probably not. But still, there is something here going on. There is a tradition of books happening here that has not been identified. So now, some conclusions. Returning to our initial point, it is fundamental to distinguish between the Hispanicity of astral magic or the existence of Hispanic astral magic. I will agree with Whale Parrot. The Hispanicity of astral magic is a silly idea. However, the identification of these three books at least guarantees us that there was such a thing as astral magic in Hispania or Iberia. It's a circulation, it was among marginals and criminals, done either orally or through manuscripts that don't leave much of a bibliographical mark. And even besides this, astral magic, while not being the most common form of magic, is not particularly rare in Iberian Inquisition trials. I can name the trial of Diego Alfonso Medrano from the Toledo Inquisition, he had a number of books that were seized. None of them seemed to be image magic books, but he was nonetheless quite adept at making astrological talismans. So there was a general awareness of how to produce a talisman in Iberia. Besides this, there's a prosecutor's notebook that mentions, there's a denunciation in there against Manuel Figueiredo, who was the chief cosmographer of the Kingdom of Portugal. And he was known to entertain and receive astral magicians and talisman makers in his home. And that piece of paper there, that belonged to a guy called Giovanni Battista. He was Italian, he was Milanese, but he lived in Lisbon. He was a talisman maker, and his talismans were highly sought by the Lisbon nobility. And so all of this guarantees the common occurrence of astral magic in the early 17th century. You should notice that all of these trials are from the early 17th century. So beyond this, there isn't much more of a conclusion I can say. I believe all this evidence points to the existence of Iberian astral magic. It's a form of magic that currently is completely underexplored and doesn't have that much representation in secondary literature. So it's a new thing. Thank you.